Thank you, Carrie-Ann.
Developing principles by which to guide human interaction, whether to mitigate the risks or facilitate the rewards, is of utmost importance in securing our conditions for flourishing. Paramount among these conditions is freedom. But what is it? How do we achieve it? How do we maintain it? Aristotle and Rand are both clear that freedom is not the liberty to do whatever one wants. That would be unbridled hedonism, which John Locke calls license, as distinct from liberty. They also believe that freedom requires some sort of order that reflects the conditions needed for humans to achieve a good life. That includes limiting the harmful effects of others' irrational actions, to be free from the initiation of force. Beyond this, they somewhat differ over the nature and purpose of freedom, the implications of which we'll appreciate more fully in section 2 of the presentation. For Aristotle, freedom also involves the leisure to engage in philosophical and political activity, since he thinks that it's primarily by means of these particular activities that one acquires the knowledge and virtue needed for flourishing. Rand, in contrast, has a more expansive concept of freedom. She holds that freedom is the opposite of slavery, and that it's the fundamental requirement of man's mind. We are free when other individuals don't compel us, and the government does not engage in physical coercion, at least not the initiation of physical force. This anticipates the role that politics plays in freedom, but for now we'll highlight intellectual freedom, freedom of action, and freedom of association. Individuals are free to think, express their views, converse, disagree, and trade the fruits of their work with others who do likewise. Among these fruits is knowledge. Since we are conceptual, reasoning beings, we can represent the world to ourselves, create language, and share our thoughts with others. We can exchange with them when we create the results of our thinking. Hence, Rand notes that the two great benefits of living in society are knowledge and trade. These benefits exponentially redound through the generations, so long as repositories of learning are not lost or destroyed, like the burning of Alexandria's library, which I still haven't gotten over. Who knows how many works of Aristotle's were lost? Okay. Oh, yes, the sigh is real. And that's because we stand on the shoulders of those giants who went before, and so we don't have to, create the wheel all over again. We can benefit from the knowledge that they pass on to us through their language. Look around you right now. Light, sound amplification, plastic bottles, and what seems to be the go-to item for objectivists, your iPhones. Think of all the prior knowledge and creations that each one of these products builds on. How many of you have read iPencil by Leonard Read? Oh, okay, good, about 50%. What's that about? iPencil. The creation of the pencil, yes. What else? Division of labor, yes. Spontaneous order, yes. Okay, thanks, Jack. One person can't do it, so elaborate a bit. Mm-hmm. Okay, I think that's enough to work with. No, you're you're absolutely right, and so you don't need to recreate iPencil. I think that was no. I asked the question, so you quite rightly gave me the answer, and all of you gave right aspects of what it's about. It's about many things. But a significant point in this particular context is the fact that it takes thousands, perhaps tens of thousands of people, not pre-planned, all together. It's not like there's some central pencil mechanism czar who said, okay, let me figure out how to best make these pencils. Different people, right, are cooperating independently, and then they come up with ideas and they try them out, etc. It takes thousands of people to produce something that seems as simple as a pencil. It's remarkable. So imagine if you had to write a new treatise called iPhone. I'm not even going to try because I'm good mechanically. Like I can help tune up an engine, but when it comes to computers, I know how to push the on button. So the production of that would take me hours just to unravel and identify a fraction of its productive journey, like you started with the pencil jack. And not to mention the lifetimes of study and experimentation needed to reach the point that Steve Jobs did. That's how we stand on the shoulders of giants and cooperate through our individual choices to create this remarkable economy. Now, Aristotle also saw trade and knowledge as benefits of living in society. Here are two ways. First, he notes that self-sufficient human living is not achieved in isolation. He does say self-sufficiency is important, but it takes a number of external conditions by which to achieve your best self. And that's not done on a desert island. We cannot alone create what we need to flourish, and flourishing is the condition he's seeking as the highest good. And he discusses at some length how the virtue of justice is involved in exchange. So he's not anti-trade or commerce, but I'll flesh that out a little bit. His views are not as advanced as Ayn Rand's are on this. He also explains how we can theorize better and achieve greater self-knowledge with other people, especially those character friends I mentioned yesterday. It's not easy to see ourselves and our proclivities to error all by ourselves. So it's good to surround yourself with people who are committed to keeping you on the straight and narrow. Heck, we could even learn from our enemies. Think of Howard Rourke in The Fountainhead when he learned something about himself from Ellsworth Toohey via his stooge Hopton Stoddard. Stoddard says when he's trying to persuade Rourke to design a temple of the human spirit, "You're a profoundly religious man, Mr. Rourke, in your own way. I can see that in your buildings." Rourke is astonished that he should learn something about himself, about his buildings, from this man who had seen it and known it before he knew it. So that's just one small example of even Howard Rourke learning something from somebody else about himself, achieving some important glimmer of self-knowledge. I'll briefly touch on voluntariness here to underscore the way choice plays a role in freedom, or the many ways in which it does. At the most fundamental level, while no one chooses to be born, each one chooses to live. I'm going to bracket the cases of those who are forced to remain alive when they no longer wish to. That's a separate, involved discussion. Once the choice to live is implicitly or explicitly made, one chooses to engage in thinking and then producing the values needed to live. Next up is the choice involved, or the many choices involved, in dealing with other beings of volitional consciousness. A man's mind may be the source of wealth, but it takes the additional factor of a free market in which you can convert those ideas into products and then a job and a successful livelihood. Productive work can be pursued in any field and to whatever level of ability you possess. Individuals can come up with all kinds of intriguing, even path-breaking ideas that you'd love to make millions of dollars from, but others need to be willing to pay for those ideas and products, else they shall go unrewarded. Think about what happens on either end of a forced transfer of goods. If I were compelled to design the next smartphone, it would probably be called the dumb phone. I'd stare blankly at a piece of paper. At very best, I could produce a piece of plastic junk. This is what Rand means when she says that a mind cannot be forced. A gun is not an argument. Now, if you were compelled to buy my piece of plastic junk that you did not choose, you'd either leave it unused, give it away, or throw it out. This disconnects the producer from causality, that is, from the information needed about his product that only voluntary transactions can provide. So in such a quasi or pseudo-economy, The quality of products degrades, resentment builds, and fewer useful products would be created. Compulsion kills innovation. Voluntariness is thus needed for markets to exist and thrive. Working for a living in order to sustain oneself to the best of one's ability involves virtue, most obviously the virtue of productiveness. Recall that virtues are actions or ways of being that achieve our values. Since I discussed virtue yesterday morning, I won't say a lot more about it here, except to note some ways in which virtue plays out in a social context, especially markets. The flip side of freedom is responsibility. Ultimately, you owe it to yourself to take responsibility for being virtuous. Central to that is being rational, reality-oriented, committed to what Rand calls the primacy of existence. This means that one takes reality as a given and refuses to engage in wishful thinking, or what Rand calls the primacy of consciousness. A person is rational to the extent that he is devoted to seeing what is really there and then chooses to live accordingly. That includes grasping all that is involved in living in a social context. It can be easy in a social context to take human ingenuity and what it makes possible for granted, to assume that what exists is part of the metaphysically given rather than the man-made. Roads, sanitation trucks, books, music, loaves of bread, and iPhones do not grow on trees, although some of my students act like they do. It would be dishonest and unjust not to give proper credit to what humans made. Justice requires, as we heard yesterday, that you acknowledge, yes, you did make that. And you either compensate the producer of that good or call him out on the shoddiness of the product, as the situation requires. Sadly, many people will be shocked to hear the word virtue uttered in the same sentence as free markets. They associate markets with predatory conduct and assume that capitalism licenses and rewards such behavior. Contrary to this assumption, achievement in the free market requires the best, not the worst within us. Addressing this charge that capitalism is exploitative and vicious serves two functions. One, it's a matter of justice. It offers us the chance to correct a widespread false belief. Two, it allows me to tease out certain nuances of the metaphysical and moral case for markets before I shift fully to the political and legal dimensions of capitalism and freedom. To the charge that the free market is exploitative, I say yes, it is, in the sense of taking advantage of opportunities for productivity and value creation. The way in which this is done makes all of the moral difference. Capitalism exploits opportunities by means of creativity, reason, and consent. And here, I promise you, Richard Salzman and I did not pre-plan this connection. He did leave me with a homework assignment, one which I had already anticipated unwittingly. And here, I'm going to say a bit about the root of the word capitalism, which is caput, Latin for head, source, or beginning. Using one's head, or more precisely, your mind, is what capitalists, rightly understood, do. They are the source of the capital, the tangible resources that they bring into existence. Some might reply, oh, that's good capitalism. However, I'm not going to let them make that move. Bad capitalism is not capitalism, but rather predation or cronyism. Those activities acquire or expropriate resources not through value creation or trade, but by force, fraud, and deceptive manipulation of the vulnerable. So-called predatory capitalists are not acting in their own rational self-interest. Rand's trader principle of offering value for value through mutual consent requires virtue, not vice. Virtue promotes one's survival. Virtuous trading is in one's self-interest because leaving others free to compete in markets to be as amazing and productive as they can be, that's what makes possible the vastly expanding network of knowledge, goods, and services that each one of us can benefit from. The second-handedness of force, fraud, and manipulation violate the virtues of rationality, independence, and honesty. Say that you're plundering the rational productivity of others, like the thug on Craig's desert island, or the not until long ago desert island. Once you've used that person, taken what he's created and destroyed him, then what will you do? How will you live? You took the fish, killed the fisherman, and still don't know how to fish. Great. So you can either stand there hungry and dying, or think, learn how to fish and live. Or even better, learn how to produce something a fisherman wants, say shoes, and trade him shoes for fish. Ultimately, the task of living can only be done by thinking for yourself. Contrary to what the critics allege, predation is not good for capitalists, just that it's not good for their trading partners, whether they be employees, owners, shareholders, or customers. However essential is the virtuous producer's role in creating and sustaining a free market that's in everyone's self-interest, he could not do this effectively without the appropriate legal and political context in which to conduct business. Such a context fundamentally protects freedom of contract, which is what undergirds the voluntary exchange of value for value. The intellectual freedom one needs in order to think and act for your survival depends on political and economic freedom. That is, it depends on the freedom to produce based on our ideas and the freedom to keep the fruits of our creation. Without such protection, almost no one would take the risks involved in producing or trading. That would keep us locked at best in a subsistence-level barter economy, and that's hardly a model for human flourishing. So let's not try to romanticize that way of life. Imagine being dropped in the middle of the woods somewhere without books or electronic devices or any tools. Are you having fun yet? When I ask my students to imagine this, at least 50% of them get large, frightened eyes. And they admit that they would likely die within days. They don't even know how to, grab fish out of a river. Aristotle and Rand both reject anarchy, recognizing that political society is needed to protect individuals in their pursuit of a good life. Aristotle says that the one who first constituted a city is responsible for the greatest of goods, because when separated from law and adjudication, man is the worst of all animals. Rand spells out how anarchy would lead to such brutality. Without organized protection against the initiation of force, individuals would have to go about armed or join a protective gang, bringing about the degeneration of that society into the chaos of gang rule. But rejecting anarchy still leaves open what form of politics will work best. Aristotle and his students gathered and studied 158 constitutions in an effort to figure out which political system would best enable humans to flourish. Rand justifies capitalism on the moral ground that it promotes flourishing. The capitalism requires individual rights as the linchpin of ethics, politics, economics, and law. I refer to this as the Lego my ego portion of the argument. If you remember that funny old waffle commercial. Okay, Lego my ego. If you don't, you'll have to look at YouTube after the session. Ego is ancient Greek for I, the root of the egoistic moral theory that grounds individual rights. Now, since Craig Biddle spent the previous session detailing Rand's view of the nature and justification of individual rights, I'm not going to rehash all of that. So I just want you to keep in mind that rights are not self-evident, nor are they constructed by the whim of God or man. And I want to also note, this applies most fundamentally to those who've reached the age of reason. When we think about this in the context of children, the texture of rights is different. So if you want to explore any of that Q&A, could do so. But I just wanted to note that this discussion about individual rights, the way in which we've been talking about it thus far at the conference, most straightforwardly applies to adults. Defending capitalism on moral grounds requires fighting against millennia of prejudice against both manual labor and money-making. Think, for example, of the biblical proverb of how it's easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than it is for a rich man to gain entrance to heaven. Or how Shylock is scorned for making money on loans in Shakespeare's The Merchant of Venice. We also must fight against Aristotle's misunderstanding of economics, particularly finance. He approves of the creation of money for the ease of trading goods that are required for living, but he's wary of the growth of markets and the desire to acquire a great deal of goods and money, since he thinks it can tempt many people into acquiring without limit, rather than maintaining the focus on acquiring it virtuously and living well. But that's why he was reluctant to grant such individuals, the hoi polloi or the many, full citizenship rights, since he thought that they lacked virtue, or the requisite virtue, and would create unjust laws that pander to special interests to the detriment of others. I wonder if that's ever happened. Aristotle also harshly disparages what we would call banking and finance, especially the earning of interest on money, and he even goes so far as to call this activity contrary to nature. So he really didn't grasp the power of financial markets. I think that a good deal of Aristotle's uneasiness here is caused by a couple of interrelated premises he holds. One is that manual laborers, merchants, and the like are insufficiently free, that is, they lack enough leisure time to cultivate their rational faculties. Another is that man's intellectual or spiritual labor is more valuable than his physical labor. Mental products are more valuable than physical products, as though the two were not interwoven sides of the same coin. I find these claims problematic in different ways, and in fact, I think it's actually inconsistent with Aristotle's general view about the integrated nature of the human being. So he fails to pay adequate attention to how all individuals could learn and develop virtue, in part through productive activities. Rand does not make this error. She appreciates that those who produce, who work with their hands and make money, also discover and apply knowledge. They innovate, produce job opportunities, and increase living standards. In short, they create wealth by virtuously applying their minds to the task of living, leading to win-win outcomes. She offers capitalism as our best hope for flourishing, securing ourselves against future need, and bringing within reach to multitudes that leisure Aristotle so dearly prizes. Placing clothes in a washing machine. Takes you a minute to pop them in. They take an hour, maybe once a week, twice a week, instead of washing them by hand for 8 to 10 back-breaking, hand-chapping hours every week. You had to set aside an entire workday just to do laundry. What do you do with that hour of time that you're waiting for or probably not waiting for the wash to be done? Probably lots of cool stuff and creating value. Now just multiply that by the many time and labor-saving devices you now own. So too bad Aristotle didn't understand how much productive work really could produce the leisure that he loved. While Rand understood economics far better than Aristotle, he had his share of remarkable insights for his time about the role of politics and law in creating the conditions needed for individual human flourishing. What's the purpose of political society? How should we constitute it? What's the best form of government? How should we structure that form? Aristotle argued that we're by nature political animals. By that, he means that we need to use our reason as part of our nature to complete the conditions needed for us to live as the kind of beings we are. We use our reason to think, create language, conceptualize justice, and form political society with laws, all for the sake of flourishing. He also says the political good is justice, and justice is the common advantage. He categorizes the 6 basic forms or constitutions a political society could take, and then calls ones mixed from these various others that could take on many other forms. And here is from his Politics. Whenever the one, kingship, the few, aristocracy, or the many, polity, rule for the common benefit, these constitutions must be correct. But if they aim at the private benefit, whether of the one, tyranny, of the few, oligarchy, or the multitude, democracy, they are deviations. Correct constitutions are those that promote the benefit of both ruled and ruler, while the deviant ones for the benefit of only the rulers at the expense of the ruled. The common advantage is not a utilitarian conglomeration, but is the advantage of all of us, both in common and separately, as individuals. For various reasons, Aristotle argues that the best constitution is aristocracy, but he says the second best, and probably, in fact, the best, because it's going to be stable over the long haul, and hence good, is a mixed constitution that blends elements of aristocracy and polity, ruled by the best few, with a certain kind of multitude, all with a view to the common advantage for the interest of each individual to be promoted. So the purpose of political society is to create and foster the conditions needed to achieve individual human flourishing. Rand is clear that political society and its form of government are justified only to the extent necessary, whatever that extent is. I'm sure we'll hear from Richard a little bit later, the nature of that extent, for the protection of individual rights. And government is the means of placing the retaliatory use of force under objective control so that it holds a monopoly on the legal use of physical force in a given territory to defend those individual rights. The proper functions of government will determine its structure. The functions include police to protect individuals from criminals, military to protect them from foreign invaders, and law courts to settle disputes between citizens. This too protects each and all. This is the sort of political society that the American founders created, what's called republicanism, that is a constitutionally limited representative democracy, not democracy unbridled, which would be populist mob rule unchecked by a just purpose. Republicanism is the deliberately mixed form of constitution that the founders designed, in part, influenced by Aristotle, especially through Alexander Hamilton and John Adams, an influence we can see in Hamilton, Madison, and Jay's The Federalist Papers. And this actually fosters a harmony of interests, not a conflict of interests. Both Aristotle and Rand thought that when you understand the self properly and the human good properly, getting stuff at somebody else's expense is never in your self-interest. And Rand has a separate essay where she says the conflicts of men's interests and explains her argument why that's an oxymoron. There is no conflict of interest between rational individuals. I'm just going to say a few words about legal system before we turn to an exercise. While a political society has its purpose and proper parameters, it takes a legal system to give it life. What sorts of institutions do we need in a legal system? What laws should we have? How and by whom should those laws be enforced? Applied? There are two aspects of this that kind of work together, rule of law and objective law. And they're distinct, though they're intertwined in Aristotle's and Rand's views. Rule of law is a formal principle whereby a political system embodies its rules in a public written form by means of an authorized procedure in a constitution and statutes. And it guides social conduct in relation to those laws, not by the arbitrary dictates of men. They're to be applied impartially, not in an ad hoc manner by the dictates of individuals, and not retroactively. The formal principle is insufficient, though, for governing properly. You could apply a formal principle by the rule of law with substantively unjust laws. The content of the laws is at least as important as the impartial application of the procedurally just law. So you have to have law that's, the principles themselves, the content is objectively valid, to have a morally legitimate political and legal system. And how to set this up in a more formal and detailed way is beyond the parameters of this presentation. But you have to think about what branches of government you have, what separation of powers, how to set up a system of checks and balances between those powers in order to make sure that people are clear on what their particular job function is in this political and legal system, and how they can kind of watch the watchers watching each other, right, which is a perennial problem of political and legal philosophy. Well, we should be wary of Aristotle's illiberal tendencies. His wariness of democracy and the potential for voters and demagogues to hijack politics and derail them from their proper function is warranted. Rand rightly insists that government should be in the business only of protecting individual rights. But what's required to accomplish that? Are good institutional structures and written law sufficient barriers to abuse? Or do they need to be accompanied by virtuous individuals working in those institutions? If the latter, how can we ensure that the right people get appointed to or voted into those positions? If we cannot, what other means are rationally open to us? Aristotle and Rand pull in somewhat different directions in answer to these pressing questions, questions we still wrestle with to this day. The matter is as urgent as it ever was. And this is how I want to transfer over to an exercise, because I think we, in fact, are part of the solution. Now here's a little exercise. Now I'm getting into my comfort zone because I teach Socratically, I don't lecture, so I'm very happy to step away from the lectern. I'm going to ask you to do a 2-part exercise. And we'll spend a little bit of time discussing it. So part 1, identify one law that you think should be repealed. And you can write on the back of your outline if you want to. One law you think should be repealed. Please keep it to 1. You probably have 5 bajillion of them. That's the easy part, the complaining part. Now I'm going to ask you the more difficult part, the part about justification, because this is where you take on responsibility as an individual thinker in the universe in interaction with your citizen cohorts. You're going to have to justify to people why it's in their self-interest to help you repeal this law. Back of her head, I got ears in the back of mine. Okay, so take 2 or 3 minutes. Just jot down whatever phrases come to mind. Okay, this is going to be a little bit of a crash course in a spontaneous in-class writing assignment. I would normally take probably 60 to 90 minutes to do this in a discussion with people in workshop fashion. But I'm just going to do enough with you just to get the flavor of how you could do this. So now that you've all jotted, hopefully all of you, unless you're left with a blank sheet of paper like I would be with designing a new smartphone. But I see a lot of people have jotted stuff down. Congratulations. You've just written your first rough draft for an op-ed. It's a good takeaway, isn't it? So you don't just complain, you've got some ammunition in mind. So first, let's get 2 or 3 of these laws to be repealed on the board. Social Security. Okay, that would have been one of my top ones. So we've got Social Security, forced union membership, I think Aristotle should have amended humans by nature are complaining animals. Well, there's a lot to complain about, so it's quite fair. I asked for it. Forced union membership, and I heard taxation. Okay. That's a good start. We're going to spend a couple of minutes on this. But at the very least, even if we don't get to address yours or talk about it at great length, that's okay, because you don't have to stop thinking about it once the session is over. Right? It's not like your mind will shut down after 11:30. Okay, so what 2 reasons? Let's do the Social Security one. Okay, that's very abstract. Somebody will say, what do you mean, the freedom to pursue happiness? Getting a Social Security check in my pocket just gave me a lot of money. I can pursue happiness with my Social Security check, so how is it not in my interest to get it? Okay. That's a good start. Here's a good start. Okay, so reason number 1, right, with the money, you keep, you determine your investment strategy. Oh, but that's such hard work. Why don't I just let somebody else do it for me? Oh, you could fire them. But you, okay, so I can't fire the government from the investment. Oh, hire somebody. Oh, that costs money. Could hire somebody better than the government. Okay, good. Well, you can't fire the government either. Okay, all right. Those are other people. I said you were self-interest. Oh, you have, okay, all right. So you're not going to stick it to your daughter? All right. So don't inflict. All right, so we got more than 2. Good. You probably could have 15 to 20 if you're like really getting the nitty-gritty easily. So don't inflict burden on younger loved ones. Right? You might not care about your neighbor's kids, but you do care about yours. Although it'd be nice if you have nice neighbors and neighbor kids. All right, I think we only have time to do this, because I want to leave plenty of time, because we have about 14 minutes left for Q&A. I just wanted you to get the flavor of thinking through this. Right, it's not easy, right? Because I know that a lot of people are tempted, just like when you're thinking about individual rights, and you're trying to explain to people why they do or don't have rights. I was very sympathetic with one of the questions that someone posed to Craig Biddle about how do you explain to somebody. And it's like, well, it's a lot of hard work to really think through. And a good first step is to say, well, why is it in my self-interest to get rid of Social Security? It might be obvious in your mind, but it's not easy to articulate. Right? Then other people, took you a lot of hard work to figure it out for yourself. Then another element of hard work is making an argument with others who don't yet agree with you and might not ever. So if you can distill for yourself some nitty-gritty, really clear reasons why it would be in their self-interest, right? Because they're thinking in terms of those tangible goods they're getting from the current status quo setup. Right? They're getting that check. They're paying their groceries with it, and they even paid into the system. What if you were willing to bite the bullet and say, all right, I've been paying into Social Security, in my case now, for 32 years. I started working, and at least on the books, paying taxes. Right before then, I babysat and mowed lawns and didn't declare anything. I guess now the government knows that. Okay, so when I was 11, I babysat. Okay, so at age 18, I start making money that Mr. FICA takes a bite. I didn't know who Mr. FICA was. I thought it was a person. I was like, what is that on my paycheck? I don't get to keep anymore. So then I realized, so are you willing to bite the bullet and say, okay, 32 years I've been paying in. I am willing to cut that loss if you repeal this law right now. I will tell you why. I'll give you a whole lot of reasons why it's in my self-interest to stop it. And I'll also explain to you why it's in your self-interest. So you've got yourself a good head start on an op-ed. If this is the one that you picked, maybe you picked a different one and you've generated some reasons. But now you have the means to go out there in the world and talk with people about this. Why is it in their genuine self-interest to get rid of these laws that are violating individual rights? So do it one issue at a time, one mind at a time. That's how you change a culture. I think that's a really important thing to walk away from this conference with, is how you can go out into the world and matter in these ways, to live these ideas that you love and that you want to flourish by, and want to help other people flourish by too, in an egoistic way. Because it's in all of our self-interest to be surrounded by such individuals, not just friends, but fellow citizens and other people in the universe. So I know you're all probably like, I want to get mine on the board now. We could be here all day doing that. And perhaps at meals and such, we can talk further about this. But at least you've got the kind of the prompt here that you can take and apply to any particular issue you have of interest, and talk about it with people before you leave the conference about how best to go forward with this sort of strategy. But I'd like to open up the floor now to Q&A. So thank you. Oh, Fernando.
Why not? You mentioned Aristotle's conception of man as a political animal.
Yes.
He used zoon politikon, and I wanted you to speak a little more about that term.
Okay.
For two reasons. One, it's a term that's been used to justify the use of coercion and compulsion to get people to comply with the social order. Many a heretic went to their smoky death with Aristotelian arguments of that nature. The other, I think, is he took a Platonic view in some respects at approaching the question of government as to who should rule. Should it be the best? Should it be the few? Should it be the many? Karl Popper in the 20th century said that that was the wrong question. The question was, how do we limit the power of compulsion and coercion so that we may act on our own judgment regardless of who rules? So I'll leave that to you.
Yeah, okay. If you didn't hear Fernando's question, you mentioned the Greek term zoon politikon, right? So being a political animal, that it's been used to justify in Platonic fashion, like the philosopher king, the kind of totalitarian rule. I think Aristotle departs from Plato significantly on this issue, and that he has, if he were more consistent and had understood banking and finance better, that he could have had the resources in his own view to work these out, but he didn't. He was more of a biologist than a social scientist, and I don't think was as good at some aspects of social science and alternative explanations for actual human conduct than he could have been. But he was really good at a lot of other stuff, and had, I think, the seeds of ideas. He was not, as I mentioned in the presentation, a utilitarian calculator in some ways the way in which Plato was in his Republic, where he defends the rule by philosopher king, and not only are other people in the political society governed by means of extremely coercive and controlling rules that are anti-individualist, but the people who were the rulers also had to be dragged into it, whether they liked it or not. And Plato thought it was actually better if the philosophers didn't want to rule, because they would be less likely to abuse the power. If only that were the case. But Aristotle disagreed with that in a few ways. I don't think he's blameless in terms of his general political and legal structure, and partly because of the reasons I pointed out in the presentation, but that he very importantly thought that the purpose of politics was to set up conditions of individual flourishing, and that it was not a utilitarian calculation about doing so, and that any rules would do. He wanted to take into account a variety of political values. Freedom is a value. And he thought that the free members of a political society would be resentful if they were not included in the political process, and that there indeed were certain, this is why he said that there are certain types of multitudes that if they were to participate in the two-part political structure of deliberation and decision, what we would call the legislative and judicial functions, that in fact, especially in deliberation, certain sorts of multitudes who had certain types of virtues, say, the military virtue of the hoplite, and people who weren't just, in his views, just manual laborers, but were craftsmen. They had a certain kind of experience and expertise that could prove useful as deliberating partners in a political process. So he thought that some of the best people of what he called the middle class could actually help provide information to the aristocrats. And for him, the aristocrats, it's not like the feudal system where just having money, that's oligarchy, where you think that money can be used as a tool of political power. And the aristocrats were those who Aristotle considered the virtuous best. And in his sense of virtue, possessing the virtues which include justice and honesty and friendship and such. So his view about the aristocrats is highly demanding. In some sense, it's like Rand's best person. It's a very demanding moral system. And if those particular types of people were involved in politics, deliberation and decision, and applying laws, the political society would be relatively free and just. So he had very high expectations for politicians, many of whom didn't live up to it. So in a lot of ways, he had ammunition that was not Platonic. I think he rejected Plato's totalitarian tendencies or explicit totalitarian manner. But I don't want to also turn Aristotle into this bastion of classical liberal theory that he wasn't. He wasn't fully consistent. I thought he held some false beliefs in these regards that were incompatible with some of his better views. So your point's well taken. He's not blameless, but I don't think he's as bad as Plato, and he actually rejected some of his key claims about politics. You're welcome. Yes?
Am I correct that the main source, not source, that's the wrong word, the main treatment of leading a good life is found in the Nicomachean Ethics? Is that correct?
Yes.
All right. Now,
sorry, my cover is kind of there.
That being the case, I have read the Ethics, and I found it very, what's the word I'm looking for? It was not abstract. It was how, under these circumstances, you should do this. Now, he does talk about friendship and such, but I've been trying to identify in my own mind what system, other than the Aristotelian mean, what system would you term Aristotle's system? It's not individualist per se. It's not altruist per se.
I'm not quite sure what your question is, but he's an egoist. And I could point to dozens of places in the Nicomachean Ethics where he says that you should make these choices for your own good, for the sake of your own eudaimonia, right, for yourself. Your best version of yourself should always be the ideal that you choose to live up to every day, and recognizing the ego in others.
I read the Ethics way before I was exposed to Ayn Rand.
Okay. Well, I'd urge you to reread Nicomachean Ethics.
I probably will now.
Okay. And you probably will, and also it depends on the translation. The two best translations, Joe Sachs, S-A-C-H-S, or Terence Irwin. Those are two excellent translations of the Nicomachean Ethics, who don't mistranslate some really key metaphysical and moral terminology. So please reread it, and with that in mind, you'll probably pick up on a lot of nuances of Aristotle's egoism that you might not have noticed before. Hi, Tully.
So last night, Robin Field was lamenting that he accidentally attributed A is A to Aristotle, but he discovered it was actually, the phrase was devised later in history. But I recently reread Atlas Shrugged, and I think Rand might have made the same mistake. Did she attribute A is A to Aristotle? And also, what was Aristotle's contribution? Was it his logic, or was it any of this other stuff?
Oh.
Sorry, I know.
Okay, no, it's two,
okay, we can, sorry.
Two questions. Okay, so the A is A point. No, Robin was absolutely right, and I don't think Rand says Aristotle said A is A. It's not like alpha.
I think it's in the Galt speech. Sorry.
Oh, okay. No, no.
Contradict
It's quite a plausible interpretation because in his all of his logical works and his metaphysics, he says, you know, a thing is what it is, and another way of saying it is the law of identity, A is A. He didn't say alpha is alpha. He didn't put it exactly like that, but it's the same meaning. So in terms of interpreting what the meaning is, so if the sense is the same, then, and the referent of the two phrases is the same, then she's just recasting it in a formal principle, the law of identity. But that's present in Aristotle in his logical works and in his metaphysics. So she wasn't making that up, but he didn't formulate it precisely that way. A is A.
Okay.
So that was the easier one to address. Their other question?
What was his contribution primarily when we emphasize his influence on the West? Was it his rules of logic, or was it any of these other ideas he contributed?
Oh, that's a great question.
Oh, well, it's not an easy one.
No, it's not an easy question because the people who were commenting on Aristotle's thought, I'd say the three main areas, although really all the areas, because it's a system of beliefs that's developed over a course of treatises. Certainly his prior and posterior analytics. Posterior analytics in particular, because posterior analytics is about his epistemology and philosophy of science. His physics, which doesn't mean what we think of physics, his biological works about the nature of living entities, which undergirds his view on ethics, which he builds on in Nicomachean Ethics, which then he builds on in Politics. So these works dovetail with one another. So I'd say his logical treatises, his biological treatises, Ethics and Politics were works that subsequent thinkers, particularly in the humanist and Renaissance eras, as his works were exhumed from the medieval period, those are the ones that the leading thinkers of the time were commenting on primarily, although people refer to Aristotle's rhetoric and his poetics. Oh, time for just one more quick question. Thank you, Conrad. Hi, Marcia.
Hi, how are you?
Good.
Good. Do you think that Rand was able to benefit from the example of the scientific industrial revolutions to see things about the implementation of the intellect in life that Aristotle wouldn't have been able to see?
She said so, yes. However, I'm not completely convinced of that. This is a discussion I've had with a number of people over the years, because ideas had to precede the Industrial Revolution. It didn't just emerge out of nothing. People had to have appreciated the role of productivity. There's a lot of human history that's been lost because of the destruction of records and people being wiped out, that who knows how many times people discovered the importance of the productive mind and things were created and then destroyed and lost. So, well, she did have the benefit of it. Who did the people of the Industrial Revolution have the benefit of? Francis Bacon, exactly. There were scientists who were experimenting and testing. Aristotle himself had a preliminary version of the scientific method. I call it the experiential method because he certainly didn't systematize like the scientific method that got developed later on, but he looked to the world, he looked to reality, looked to experience, and tried to systematize human knowledge, sciences, based on those observations. It was observationally grounded, and you had to look at multiple instances and go from perception to concept formation, and then look and see whether that explanation matched the world, or you had to revise your beliefs. So I think he had a proto-version of it. He also lived on the heels of the golden age of Greece. Stuff was created, albeit a lot of it by means of, impressing people into labor and slavery, etc. So certainly seeing the Industrial Revolution was a great benefit to be able to look back and be like, analyze how did that happen? But the fact that it did happen, prior things had to have occurred. And those people understood the power of the mind and wanted to be free to create. And when they weren't, a lot of stuff was lost. So I think people were putting puzzle pieces of it together, and some people more or less systematically, but she really I think left us a wonderful legacy of her thought on looking scrupulously at the causal mechanisms behind the Industrial Revolution, and kept giving us the tools to think carefully about and argue with people about reclaiming that. So thank you. Thank you.